The first thing you notice in a truly crowded place isn't what you see, it's what you feel. Air that turns warm faster than it should, sound that becomes a single moving wall, the strange pressure of bodies sharing the same few square feet, where even standing still takes coordination. At a certain point, a crowd stops acting like a collection of individuals and starts behaving like something else entirely. A flowing mass with its own physics, its own weak points, its own rules. Crowds can be joyful, like a festival that spills into the streets. They can be routine, like a commuter surge that arrives every morning to the minute. They can also be dangerous when density rises and exits shrink and small disruptions ripple outward. Today we're going to travel through the world's most crowded places, not just to marvel at the scale, but to understand how those places function at all. How do millions of people move without constant collapse into chaos? Where does crowding come from? And what happens when the system is pushed past its limit? Crowding isn't just a lot of people. It's people packed into space so tightly that movement changes. Engineers often talk about density in people per square meter. At around 1 person per square meter, you still have personal space and choices. At 2, your path becomes constrained. At 3 to 4, your speed drops and you start moving with the group. Past 5 or 6 people per square meter, control becomes unreliable. You don't step forward so much as you get carried forward. That's the uncomfortable truth about extreme crowding. It's not mainly psychological, it's mechanical. To see crowd physics in everyday life, you can start in one of the most crowded systems humans have ever built: urban transit. A major rail station isn't just a building, it's a set of funnels. Platforms feed stairs. Stairs feed corridors. Corridors feed gates. Every narrowing is a bottleneck, and bottlenecks decide the station's true capacity. One of the best-known examples is Shinjuku Station in Tokyo, widely reported as the busiest railway hub on Earth, serving millions of passenger movements in a day across multiple rail companies. Even if you've never been there, you've likely seen the footage. Rivers of people moving with calm precision, then compressing into dense packs the moment the geometry tightens. The reason it works isn't magic, and it isn't that commuters are somehow biologically better at forming lines. It works because the entire environment is tuned for flow. Clear signage reduces hesitation. Wide corridors reduce friction. Barriers prevent counterflows from colliding. Train doors line up with platform markings so boarding and exiting don't fight each other. If you want a comparison point closer to home, think of New York's Penn Station and its surrounding complex. Hundreds of thousands of people pass through on busy days, and the experience can feel like a constant negotiation with space. People accelerating when they see an opening, then stopping hard when the lane disappears. That stop-and-go behavior is exactly what crowd scientists call shockwaves, the same phenomenon that creates highway traffic jams with no visible cause. In a crowd, 1 person slowing down becomes 2, becomes 10, becomes a sudden wall of bodies, and the jam propagates backward even though nothing is physically blocking the route. Now move from stations to the streets above them. In the heart of Tokyo, Shibuya Crossing has become a symbol of organized chaos, with multiple crosswalks releasing pedestrian flows simultaneously. The crossing looks like a human kaleidoscope, but it's actually a carefully timed machine. The key is signal timing that creates predictable pulses. When everyone is released at once, you get a dense but synchronized movement window. When the light stops, the system resets. That pulse design prevents constant mixing, which is what causes persistent friction and raises collision risk. You can almost feel the algorithm behind it. The crowd becomes fast because the pattern is simple. Crowding isn't limited to transportation. Markets can concentrate people just as tightly, especially where geography and tradition funnel commerce into narrow lanes. Places like the old souks of the Middle East, the dense market streets of Mumbai, or the packed commercial alleys in parts of Hong Kong and Bangkok create a different kind of crowding. Slow flow. Instead of commuters optimizing for speed, shoppers optimize for access. They pause, they pivot, they reverse direction. That's a nightmare for throughput, but markets survive by being porous. Stalls open into side spaces. Alley networks branch and reconnect. The crowd doesn't need to move quickly as long as it can redistribute pressure. When a lane gets too dense, people bleed into adjacent paths. That redundancy is what keeps slow crowds from turning into stuck crowds. The moment redundancy disappears, crowding becomes fragile. You see that most clearly at mass gatherings where huge numbers of people share the same destination at the same time. Few events illustrate this like the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca, which draws millions of pilgrims during a defined period. The core challenge is not simply accommodating people, but moving them through rituals that involve shared sites, fixed routes, and synchronized timing. Crowd management there is essentially a logistics operation on the scale of a national transportation system. Routes are separated, schedules are staggered, pedestrian flows are often directed like traffic, with one-way corridors and controlled entry points. You're watching infrastructure do the work of coordination, because the crowd itself cannot safely self-organize at that density. If you've ever been in a stadium after a game, you've already felt a tiny version of the same problem. Thousands of people stand up at once. Everyone wants the same exits. The stairs become a choke point, and speed drops to the pace of the slowest person. Multiply that by 100, and you get the defining risk of extreme crowds. A small disruption can cascade. A dropped bag, a sudden stop, a rumor of danger. Another gathering that pushes density into the realm of the unimaginable is the Kumbh Mela in India, often described as the largest human gathering on Earth. On peak days, attendance is frequently reported in the tens of millions, concentrated around river confluences where ritual bathing occurs. Whether you treat those numbers as precise or approximate, the mechanism is the same. An enormous population arrives in a short window, funnels through a limited geography, and then tries to leave. It's not a single crowd, it's many crowds intersecting, merging, and splitting, like weather systems. Organizers rely on temporary cities, grids of roads, bridges. A moving crowd is risky, a stopped crowd is worse. You can see a modern urban version of that festival surge in Times Square on New Year's Eve. The crowd there is often estimated around 1 million people within a relatively confined zone, held behind barriers for hours before midnight. What makes it different from a moving crowd is that it's deliberately immobilized. Pens reduce jostling and prevent sudden counterflows, but they also create a new requirement. You must design for endurance. People need access to medical help, clear communication, and controlled release once the event ends. If you're watching from home, it looks like a celebration. On the ground, it's crowd engineering, because the easiest crowd to control is a crowd that doesn't have to move. Crowding also happens where people don't choose it, in neighborhoods where population density is driven by economics, housing shortages, and rapid migration to cities. Consider megacities that have expanded faster than infrastructure can keep up. Dhaka, Bangladesh, is often cited among the densest large cities in the world, with enormous numbers of residents packed into limited urban land. The mechanism here isn't a one-day event. It's daily life compressed, homes subdivided, narrow lanes shared by pedestrians, bikes, vendors, and motorbikes, and limited open space. Density reshapes everything, from travel time to sanitation to heat. In tightly packed districts, ventilation is reduced, and the urban heat island effect can intensify because concrete and asphalt absorb and re-radiate heat, while greenery is scarce. Mumbai provides another example of how density becomes an entire system. In some informal settlements, homes sit wall-to-wall with lanes so narrow 2 people can barely pass without turning sideways. The city's commuter rail adds a separate layer of crowding, with trains that can carry loads far beyond what most Americans would consider acceptable, especially at peak hours. The reason it still functions is brutal practicality, frequency, and familiarity. Trains arrive often, people know the routines, and crowd behavior becomes learned choreography. Even so, it's a reminder that when capacity falls behind demand, crowds will form regardless of comfort. The only question is whether the environment can absorb them safely. There's a historic case that still shocks people because it seems physically impossible. The Kowloon-walled city in Hong Kong, demolished in the 1990s. At its peak, it housed tens of thousands of people in a compact footprint, producing an extraordinary population density. What mattered wasn't just the number of residents, but the vertical stacking and the maze-like interior. Corridors narrowed, light disappeared, ventilation was poor. The city behaved like a single structure with internal streets. It's a useful extreme example because it shows what happens when density is allowed to build without planning. Systems emerge, but they're inefficient, hard to regulate, and vulnerable to hazards like fire. Modern high-density developments try to capture the efficiency of vertical living without the chaos. If you want a cleaner, modern version of vertical crowding, look at the densest neighborhoods of Hong Kong today, where residential towers rise above transit hubs and shopping complexes. The crowd isn't always visible at street level, Because it's distributed across levels. Walkways, footbridges, escalators, and connected malls form a three-dimensional pedestrian network. That's one of the most important tricks dense cities use. They add layers. Instead of forcing everyone through the same street, they build parallel paths above and below. The result is still crowded, but less brittle. When one route jams, another route absorbs the overflow. Now let's talk about what crowding does to your body and your decision-making. Because the experience changes when density rises. In a light crowd, you navigate by choosing gaps. In a dense crowd, you navigate by following pressure. Your field of view becomes less useful because your movement is constrained by the bodies around you. That's why panic narratives are often misleading. Many crowd disasters aren't caused by people panicking. They're caused by high density combined with constrained exits and poor information. When you can't see what's happening, you interpret movement as a signal. If people behind you surge, you move, even if you don't know why. If people ahead stop, you stop, even if you can't see the blockage. Information in a crowd travels through motion as much as it travels through sound. Sound matters too, but not in the way movies portray it. In loud environments, instructions can fail to penetrate. The crowd relies on local cues, what the nearest people are doing. That's why effective crowd control often uses visual signals, barriers, and route design rather than shouted orders. You can't talk a million people into behaving safely. You shape the space so safe behavior is the default. Even small architectural choices can change crowd outcomes. A staircase is a classic choke point because people instinctively slow down on steps. Add a handrail, and flow becomes smoother because people feel stable. Widen the landing, and you create a buffer where pressure can disperse. Doors are another critical detail. A narrow doorway can become a pinch point, where density rises sharply as a moving crowd compresses into a smaller opening. If that doorway opens inward, it can become blocked by forward pressure. Outward opening doors, multiple exits, and distributed entry points are all simple fixes that save lives because they prevent trapping. If you're wondering how crowded a crowd can get before it becomes dangerous, here's a useful reference. In normal walking conditions, a person might move at around 1 to 1.5 meters per second on open ground, roughly 2 to 3 miles per hour. In a dense crowd, speed drops dramatically. At high densities, movement can slow to inches per second. And when the crowd stops, pressure can still rise because people behind continue to push forward. Not out of aggression, but because they're being pushed too. It becomes a chain reaction of force transmission. That's why you'll often see crowd managers creating pressure relief by opening new routes, pausing inflow, or breaking a crowd into smaller packets. Some of the world's most crowded places aren't permanent at all. They appear when conditions align. Think of evacuation points after disasters, border crossings during migration surges, or temporary shelters where large populations concentrate. These are crowded for a different reason: urgency. The crowd doesn't just want to be there. It needs to be there, and it needs resources. In such conditions, density isn't only a movement problem, it's a supply problem. Water distribution, sanitation, medical access, and information become the limiting factors. Crowding amplifies every weakness in a system because each missing resource becomes a point of friction, and friction becomes a stall, and stalls become compression. Back in everyday life, you can feel the same principles at smaller scales. A concert venue becomes crowded when arrivals cluster. That clustering often happens because of schedules. If doors open at a fixed time and the main act begins at a fixed time, arrivals surge in a narrow window. Spread those times out, and the crowd spreads out. That's why airports use boarding groups, why stadiums open gates early, and why cities stagger school and work start times. Crowd control is often time control. When you can't enlarge the space, you enlarge the schedule. The most crowded places on Earth are not crowded by accident. They're crowded because people concentrate around opportunity, tradition, transport, and spectacle. A port city becomes dense because trade attracts workers. A sacred site becomes dense because meaning attracts pilgrims. A station becomes dense because mobility attracts commuters. A market becomes dense because goods attract buyers. The crowd is the visible surface of deeper forces. So when you see a dense crowd moving smoothly, what you're really seeing is a fragile balance holding. When you see a crowd seize up, you're watching that balance break, usually at a bottleneck where geometry and human instinct collide. Next time you step into a packed subway platform, or shuffle through a sports arena exit, or thread through a festival street, crowding, at its extreme, is one of the most honest tests of civilization. Not because it proves anything inspirational, but because it's unforgiving. Physics doesn't negotiate. Space either handles the load or it doesn't. And yet, every day, billions of people move through dense cities, packed stations, massive rituals, and crowded streets. And most of the time, it works. Not by luck, but by design, discipline, and constant adjustment. Be curious and always seek to learn something new. Subscribe and see for yourself. Thanks for watching.